welcome to Vulgar Complexity with C. Derick Varn.
And Abi Hassan.
And Abi and I are discussing the actually today's the introduction to the show, so we're discussing a lot of stuff, but once we get to the non-preliminary, what the hell is this new show? Why has Varn got so many sub shows? We will be talking about the meaning of the Skeptics movement, not just in the sense of, oh, well, the new atheists became reactionaries, because I'm not even sure that I think that at large that is true. But what was this periodizations? Why? What was it responding to? What was it bracketing out? And why was that the kind of most likely response, but highly inadequate response for a given period of time? But before that, we need to explain what this show is. So Abby and I started corresponding a few months ago via email. We've had a couple conversations. We've had a one-off attempt at the show that really led to this show. And we share interest in complexity and Marxism. And I think we share an assumption also that continental philosophy is useful, but that a lot of the insights that you get from, say, Hegel and Marx have been better picked up actually outside of continental philosophy, and definitely outside of, say, analytic philosophy, or psychoanalytic philosophy, excuse me, and also not really represented correctly or well in analytic philosophy. There we go. But because of that, complexity theory, informational theory, are really complexity theories, informational theories, is where the dynamics that are trying to be mapped out in, say, the Marxist version of the Hegelian dialectic actually end up being practically used and emergent. And I think, Abby, you even see this in a more, you see more like computational way. Like you see this very much as like we can use probability and statistics and math in a way that makes it easier to talk about historical development, right?
Well, I mean, I think that, thanks for that introduction. I think it's like, that's the hope.
Yeah, that's what right? We hope happens.
I mean, and it's like, in a lot of ways, it's this project, this idea of vulgar complexity is something that I started a few years ago. It's one of like a few of my kind of intellectual threads, and it's also, from my background, it's kind of like I think a lot of philosophy is. It's also autobiographical in a sense, because I studied computer science undergrad and had a kind of was steeped in that kind of in computational theory, and I got into information theory, but like foundations of mathematics and kind of the that original kind of logical positivism and the kind of the grand project of the early 20th century of unifying mathematics and logic. And so I was kind of steeped in all that stuff, and so always had a very was always interested in that kind of stuff, and it wasn't mystified to me, right? That it was kind of a real area of interest and a real area of study. And so, like, as my kind of progression towards leftist politics and like my deepening reading into Marxism, like that stuff was always in the background, and that was always like that kind of reconciliation between a kind of because, like, as you say, a lot of the kind of maybe even late 20th century Marxism, and then especially as filtered into the United States that we get, it's based in the humanities, right?
Right. It's based in the humanities pretending to be science, and I think that's important. Like for example, you and I mentioned this is a good introduction to this. Despite the fact that I think at certain points, the circle and the Sokal and Bremont book, fashionable nonsense is unfair to Deleuze, and at certain points it's unfair to Latour. I, by and large, actually think, and this is going to have me outed as a Philistine or whatever, and I've thought this even when I was in the humanities, that they were right about a lot of what was going on in the continental philosophical circles. But once we see what people on, say, the Skeptics movement do with that, it's almost worse than what it's critiquing. And so what do I mean by that? Well, one, for example, like Sokal and Bregmont have a very naive notion of what science is. They basically call science like rigorous common sense. And I'm like, bullshit. That is bullshit. There's no such thing as rigorous common sense. And the reason why they do that is to get out of the sociological battles of science, I think. Like, they really don't want to have to deal with the fact the institution of science and the what we might call the abstraction of science as an enterprise is separate. They're not really the same thing. And that some of the, say, post-structuralist are like Bruno Latour's critiques of the institution of science is actually quite accurate in a way that, like, later skeptics and new atheists and stuff just cannot deal with. But that is separate. That's actually a separate problem from the knowledge that is produced by those fields. So I tend to have, I tend to think that, like, there's a lot of impulses in, say, the humanities view of science that are based in reality and are accurate. Like, for example, certain kind of sciences are going to take on during certain time periods because they're more useful in that economy. That there are certain valorizations and frameworks and metaphors that we adopt in science that are politically motivated and highly problematic for that reason. These things, I think, now are pretty easy to say and still say, yeah, but, like, let's not pretend that everything is science or that everything can do what science does. That's not a controversial assertion either. And I've also, interestingly, even though we're to come down pretty hard on the skeptics movement, I have become increasingly convinced that the logical positivist of the Vienna school, in particular, most of whom were Marxist, the whole story about them being undone and in both the humanities and even in some of the sciences is totally unfair, because the people who proved that the verification and falsification criteria were not good enough for demarcation of science were the logical positivists themselves, not an outside research project. And that this indicates that it wasn't a defeated project. It just had some bad notions that I think you have to go through their logic to see why they're bad. But what I find interesting about that is that's a different thing than, say, what logical positivism or logical constructivism or whatever is it later called in America, or logical empiricism as it becomes once they drop the positivist claims. In America, its political content is shorn from it deliberately, and, like, the kind of the reason why they wanted ethics and mathematics and science to all match up was that they were fighting Heidegger and that they were fighting like fascistic relativism. They were fighting, and they were trying to come up with a way in which social science could be both logical and scientific. But to do that, we needed to pin down what logical and scientific was, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that project actually gets totally obscured by the 70s. This is before you and I get involved, but, like, that philosophical project gets really mired down in logical empiricists after Popper's commitment to anti-communism, which is like almost the opposite of the political commitments that they started with. And these are different people because the first and second generation are largely dead by the time you get to the 1970s.
Yeah, I think, it's what, we can only get, I think that great split and the effect of anti-Marxism, and the red, especially the 50s and 60s Red Scare, right, happening at the peak of American scientific dominance globally, right? So it's kind of like, the greatest if the nuclear bomb was the greatest scientific achievement, right, of the 20th century in terms of political impact, right? Like, it also had the effect um of really robbing the ability of a kind of positive scientific program from affiliating with uh, actual political program, that, you know what I mean, that just denuded of politics, and that kind of void is where I think we see that skeptic movement flourishing. But it's kind of flourishing on this foundationless end of history moment, right? This kind of artificial hegemony of post World War II America, right?
Right. So I think
And
that's great, and that's important. I think we have to look at also is the shift of the academic milieu from these salons and that have institutes and universities, but they're largely funded by all kinds of different things: the state, um, Marxist research institutes, party affiliated things, the church in Europe. Uh, there's many different institutions of science, and in the European university is more medieval, particularly before World War II. Um, that's both good and bad. It doesn't operate under capitalist prerogatives are in the auspices of the Cold War, whereas the post World War II university is a imported medieval institution, but completely removed from its medieval context in the United States. It is originally tied to primarily churches and then to state land grants later. And it is expanded dramatically during the GI Bill. And then basically the university as we know it is like a kind of shadow form of its European counterpart, but was designed and came into flourishing specifically under the guise of what we might call the Cold War largesse. I mean, and under capitalist developmentalism in competition with Cold War largesse. So that's why there's these external factors, and just like most of Europe is destroyed, most of Asia is destroyed, the United States has all the wealth. Like, it's valorizable and uses it to rebuild Europe and pretty much Europe alone, in some of the Anglo-speaking parts of the British Empire, and then tie them into our trade network, establishing a global trade network, which also gives us, educational dominance. And we have the resources to do the kind of science that, say, only the English and the Germans and the Russians really do later. And Russia becomes our major counterpart and also does massive work during this time period. And so you have a real divide at the time between the capitalist world and the Russian world. And you see all these advances come up that really get integrated in the 90s after the fall of the wall, but we are going to erase the Soviet history of all this stuff. Like, we're going to erase the Soviet history of Hardane. We're going to erase the Soviet history of probability theory. We're going to erase the Soviet history of its half of the development of cybernetics. We're going to pretend this is all the free market, even though it was absolutely everything but that. And the other thing that develops is, like, scientists are trained during the end of the 20th century, and they're trained this way to view what they do in an apolitical context. And when it does become political, it is only basically to secure their own funding. And that is something that I think kind of leads us up to the Skeptics movement and where that comes in the popular order. And I think you're right that the Skeptics movement, like the new humanist movement, is what this is during the high point of what we're talking about, right? Like, and why is it humanism and not atheism? Because militant atheism is associated with the far left. It's associated with anarchists and communists, and specifically the Soviet Union. In the 1950s is when we start putting all this religious stuff in U.S. Secular vernacular, like God we trust comes on the dollar, and we add it to the pledge, et cetera, et cetera.
And the courts.
Right. And so in the 70s, you have this sort of like ethical humanism, and the ethical humanism walks a fine line. And if you really read between the lines, it's basically saying, hey, we're going to do a detente between the socialist and capitalist thing. Like we are neutral in the whole Cold War, basically. That's the stance of like the Paul Kurtz era humanists. But what they really care about is we are going to push back on this rising religiousification that began under the guise of anti-communism to really take hold. Now, it's not like before the 1950s, America wasn't super fucking religious. It was, but religion as a civic statement that was politicized really is largely something that it kind of happens during World War II, but they're all over the map. And then the religious groups are all over the place. Some of them are progressive, some of them are conservative. But this whole anti-communist religious bent really gets solidified in the 50s and 60s and comes to power in the late 70s and early 80s. And the ethical humanists kind of say, okay, well, we're neutral on this capital socialist thing, so don't red scare us. But we're pushing back on the religious content as a social movement. What is interesting about ethical humanism is while it values science, it does not pretend that that's its only concern. It does not pretend that that's even the only thing that we can talk about truth claims about. I mean, if you read Kurtz, the Humanist Manifesto is not like that at all. But the ethical humanism movement really doesn't have a lot of sway. It never becomes a dominant force in American life. Like, in fact, it's kind of coming into being when something we might think of as like the Third Great Awakening or the rise of the evangelicals, etc.
It's when the evangelicals are kind of entering the Republican Party, right? Like
yeah, that happens. In the evangelicals are entering the Republican Party in force at the end of the 1970s. It's the biggest politicization of religion since the Civil War, which is where,
And I think it's important structurally, right? In a way, part of the evangelical entry and part of the growth of the evangelical movement broadly was a grassroots organizing and building people from school boards to city council, right? And like in each, like when you're running a school board, like it's almost just like that's what you do is create curriculum, right? Like you could even from just a basic even like whether this was science or another issue. The point is when you're running a school board, like you're gonna put in, you have to do something, right? And so I mean it's just an interesting kind of when you're building, to me it's kind of the structure of the social movement is also important to think about, right?
One of the things that I like to think about when we think about the evangelical movement is I talk about this a lot when I talk about effective dual power movements. You have Bolsheviks and you have a whole lot of religious movements, which makes people uncomfortable. And I was like, okay, dual power movements, True Torah dualism in Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, depending on the time period. And what do I mean by dual power movements? In that they both work inside and outside of institutions, and they tend to be highly coordinated but not centrally leadered in a key way. The exception is the John Birch Society, and we like that's a fun one, but that's another day. And they don't do what the liberal left impulse is to do. The liberal left impulse is to say, okay, we're going to control the universities, or we're not even aiming to take them over, but we're going to enter them to have our ideas in real contestation at the high levels, and thus we'll have a play in education. We're going to try to affect national policy, etc. The kind of dual power strategy aim is like, okay, we're going to try for this big stuff too, but we're also going to take over all the school boards. And which is something I'm like, I've always been like, leftists, why don't you actually try to take over a school board? But
well, they did in San Francisco, right?
Yeah, true. Every now and then, but what we see is in the 90s is the Soviet Union falls. All right, this is the beginning of both the Skeptics movement and New Atheism. A lot of the most zealous forms of, say, libertarianism, like Andronian objectivism, begin to burn out people within the movement. Now, that doesn't seem immediately relevant to the Skeptics movement until we talk about who some of these people are. And so, and why do you need objectivism anymore? We beat the Soviet Union. We can like, we're in control. We can have a little bit of social welfare. It's not going to end the world. Like, that's, so you see this shift from people who were, a lot of them were ideological libertarians, dedicated Cold Warriors, into this end of history culture war period. And this also happens to coincide with what we could say is like the shoring up of the periphery for areas that, for whatever cultural reason, were hard to integrate into the modern capitalist world system, which tend to be Islamicate. And not just that, but that's one of the places. And after oil is found there, that's the places that really matters, because no one really cares about Qatar or Saudi Arabia before that. And so you have this kind of cultural war rhetoric infusing the ethical humanist movement. It starts abandoning the humanist movement because, like, well, we don't need a detente between socialism and capitalism anymore because the socialists just got their ass kicked. Capitalism doesn't look to be making everyone poorer at this particular moment either. Even China seems to be on a capitalist development kick, so we can kind of back off from that. We need to fight these evangelicals. And also what starts to happen is the entire, and I think this is missed in this narrative, these parts, this is the complexity part. The Cold War largesse ends in the university because it's not needed anymore. So the university gets neoliberalized. The neoliberalization of the university comes really rather late. And the reason why is, as long as it's a Soviet Union, actually neoliberalization is sort of subsidized by this one sector that is exempt from it. And that sector is what we might call the primary research sector of education, like particularly of secondary education. That stops. So you see this real decline in scientific funding. So at this moment of like, oh, we have all the power, we, financially, U.S. has been declining for 20 years, but we won the Cold War, so yay! And we have the internet, so there does seem to be a temporary gain in economic mobility. It's kind of overstated now. People talk about the 90s as like the last great decade. I'm like, yeah, except when you control for inflation and purchasing power. The last great decade is actually like the end of the 50s, but nonetheless, I think this gives you a perfect kind of social milieu for something like the Skeptics movement to come. You have a lot of scientists who are seeing their funding cut. They're also competing with the humanities, and now they're like, well, we got to get what's ours because this funding getting cut, so fuck the humanities. Like, even though humanities stuff takes way less money to actually run. And that's kind of what's dominating the 90s. You have the sociological science wars. You have the advent of postmodernism, and I always use quotations because I don't think postmodernism is a thing. It's a periodization, but it's like 5 different movements. So some of which aren't copacetic with each other. And all that happens. Religious life in America finally starts to slowly eke towards what it's like in Europe. Now, the reason why that didn't happen is hard to say. I do think the Europeans welfare net's part of that. Like I've always pointed out, that like in the Southeast, if you were not just a person of color, but particularly if you were a person of color, but if you were anybody who was poor, your primary social welfare net is actually the church. So that in a kind of dual power way, these institutions are also protecting people's material livelihood. In the late 90s, that kind of begins to stop, partly because there's so much energy in the religious movement into just straight up Republican politics. And so a lot of the things that were considered kind of socially prosperous, but not, you could believe in one way or the other, you start having people who are like Ayn Randians who are also supposedly Christian, which is something that blows my fucking mind. But that really is a thing that you don't see really start to happen in any kind of size until the 1990s. And so the church, ironically, in giving so much power over to the GOP, is ending its dual power function and kind of subsuming itself into the Republican apparatus, which after 9/11 is going to actually cause it to die pretty quick. I mean, like, I think people, I've been hearing liberals, like, I heard Gloria Steinem go on the BBC and talk about how, like, oh, we were seeing a rebirth of evangelical Christianity. And I'm like, no, we're not. Like, there's no statistic that backs that up at all. Like, they're like a wounded, dying bear. They're lashing out because they're losing. Like,
well, it's just that, I think that maybe is the fruits of the 70s and 80s and into the 90s are bearing now in these retrograde institutions like the courts. I mean, like retrograde in terms of like these are institutions that follow society, right? Because it takes, to create the kind of, to create a judicial decision to overthrow Roe v. Wade, that's a 50-year project, right?
And right, so, just like the judicial decision to instantiate it was really like a 25-year project. But yeah,
exactly, right. So these are tailing society by decades, right? But so it might be an ascendance in the courts of a particular form of interpretation or formation of judicial thinkers, but that's just more evidence of what you're talking about in terms of the actual numbers in the churches and people's behavior is just kind of the time lag and kind of democracy lag between the people and particularly the courts as institutions.
You don't need an anti-democratic institution to enforce a social norm that would be enforced normatively anyway. Like what do I mean? Like if for example, if evangelicals, and I also like to point out that there are no evangelicals on the Supreme Court. There's not. It's all Catholics or Episcopalians or Jews. So, but if evangelicals were with the social force doing this as a kind of vanguard, then the need for this would be less relevant to a lot of these courts, and also they wouldn't have needed to create a 50-year series of steps to undo the situation. Although I do want to point out something about, and we'll get to this on a different episode when we talk about law, but when we talk about that, we have to be careful, because I do think part of the situation with the courts is that we use law in the 1960s to enforce a social detente where there really was two strong sides that were about equally powerful. and the Warren Court doing what it did seemed to be attempting to, because I do admit sometimes the legal logic of the Warren Court is tortured. Do attempt to be trying to instantiate a social peace by putting certain things into law and moving them seemingly beyond the realm of politics, which has bitten us all in the ass now that there's been a 50-year conservative project to use that power, which the Warren Courts instantiated, to side with the right.
No, absolutely. And we'll pick up this thread, I guess, another time.
Yeah, because this is your specialty.
Well, not really, not really. But as a lawyer, yes. But but it's interestingly, that's also kind of the birth of critical race theory. Especially through someone like Derick Bell, who was one of those litigators, and him kind of witnessing what it didn't do was as much the kind of birth of his legal thinking as anything else. But yeah, I think that I think we've set the stage pretty well for this kind of, this, it is such an interesting period, right? This end of history, 92 to September 11th, basically, right, is this kind of first era of the Skeptics movement. And that's kind of, when I was kind of trying to read a little bit into this, I came across something I found interesting, that was basically an attempt by some various analytic philosophers to have Derrida canceled, right?
Yeah, John Searle, I think, led this, didn't he?
I don't know if it was so. It was a Smith was.
Yeah.
But I'm sure Searle would have.
Maybe Searle. I think maybe. I'm trying to figure what. There was one analytic philosopher who led the charge, and then one analytic philosopher who's like, no, this is ridiculous. And yeah, I remember this move to get Derrida removed from his post at Stanford.
Well, no. It was to Cambridge was going to give him an honorary degree.
Oh yes.
And so someone wrote it was kind of like what was that letter that everyone was upset about a couple years ago? It was it was like a letter, signed by a bunch of philosophers saying that, well, what this man does might resemble philosophy in form. A physicist would never be able to publish with this level of rigor. It was very much of that moment, like in that kind of that skeptic movement culture war thing, where the Sokol affair, all that kind of stuff, where it was it's almost
like we don't tar postmodernism as like a serious threat to the academy, and I think that was interesting for me, because as I was also very frustrated with post-structuralist philosophy at the time, because I thought it was conservative, and then I became a conservative, and then I was still frustrated with it because I thought it was the wrong kind of conservative. But I did think, my essential argument about it had always been that the level of relativism that it espouses is highly conservative. Now that I know more about how it came to be, right, about its origins, and we could do a whole thing on that if you want to in another time, I do think it was a lot of the postmodern and post-structural turn is like a burnout from a lot of the failures of Marxism in the 1970s, particularly in France, and particularly in light of 68 and then later Mitterrand. Like if you read Jean Baudrillard's writings about how he's responding to the communists during the Mitterrand government, you realize oh, these guys were committed communists and they feel like they got sold out. And so they basically gave up all their beliefs, period, about beliefs in anything. And so in this weird way, you have two responses to the kind of failure of a bunch of different projects during the Cold War, fighting each other, both trying to figure out basically which way history died. Did it die into linguistic cul-de-sacs, or did it die into scientific funding departments? We're going to figure it out. That's what we're battling for. And what I find interesting about this, except for the fight against like increasingly theocratic impulses as the evangelical movement consolidated in the Republican Party, it is unclear what the stakes for most people are in that battle. Like that, this kind of seems like a very trumped up version of a justification for funding. Like, that seems, and by the time you get to I remember this now, it wasn't the removing us post at Stanford, it was the honorary degree thing. And by the time you get to that, it's like, you're going to go after Derrida over that. Like, really?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of. I wonder also if it's kind of this, because of this fall of the Soviet Union, right? You get this kind of triumphalism in a kind of liberal, in that kind of liberal space, right? In that kind of it's American Prometheanism, right? Like, it's like, well, there, it is Francis Fukuyama, right? It's like, not that he was whatever. We don't have to talk about
we're not going to go into how Fukuyama is actually not guilty of what Fukuyama is accused of, but yes.
But the point is, right? It's this moment where it's like, well, there aren't any big fights, let's squash the little ones. And and I agree with you that I mean, I don't have a ton of experience in academia, but I do. It does, especially this time, the ability to fight to the death over the smallest differences means that, like, that it's not surprising that people were not collegial towards their humanities brethren. But
although it's funny how many of those people were on the Epstein Express, and I'll get back to that later about this whole independent. But one of the things I think is interesting about this is Skeptic magazine is interesting because it comes out of this battle. Whereas we talked about this, there's two skeptical magazines that kind of come out. One is way older than the other. I mean, Skeptical Inquirer is the older of the two magazines, I believe by a lot. Skeptical Inquirer comes out of
it's the Center for Inquiry, or is that right?
Yeah, the Center for Inquiry is who owns it now. Originally, it's the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of the Claims of the Paranormal. And so it's just a debunking of weird shit magazine that's kind of seen as part of the larger humanist movement, because the Psychop, which is also a terrible name, comes out of that. It, however, as a magazine, I think really begins. When is it founded? In 1976. Yeah, no, Skeptical Inquirer is 1976. So it's actually part of what we would consider the ethical humanist movement, but it's in the debunking realm, which becomes in the 80s the only kind of part of that sticks. Like, all the other parts of the like ethical humanist movement kind of fall away, and we're just like, well, Bigfoot's bullshit. Like, and and so, and it kind of man, its original magazine is like really awful. It's Zetetic was what it was called. It was like Skeptical Seeker in Greek. And it started by this guy, Marcello Truzzi. But he co-founds it with Paul Kurtz, and so it directly is tied to the ethical humanism movement. Just doesn't really take off, and like I said, it's more read as like, oh well, this is like the anti-Fortean Times. We can read it for that. For those of you who don't know what Fortean Times is, this is weird, paranormal bullshitty stuff, and that's all it's concerned with for a long time. Skeptics magazine is different. It starts in 1992, and I was a partisan of it in my college years, which roughly roughly overlap with you, but because of specifically when I got involved with the Skeptics music, it's a different time. Because in the aughts, it's the side that's kind of taking the middle ground on the neoconservative side. It's actually pushing back on some of the, like the Sam Harris foreign policy stuff, but it's not. It's doing so from a conservative position, actually, but that's not immediately apparent to a lot of people. So the Skeptic Society and Skeptic magazine really starts what 1992, right?
Yeah, 92, and it started. That's why that Derrida thing is that was the same year, right? Um, so yeah, it started by Michael Shermer, right? And it's I think that I guess it's involved. It does some of the debunking stuff, right? There is a debunking thread to the magazine. I think there's a science popularizing thread,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then there's this culture war thread, right? Where it's really like we kind of discussed, taking aim at this kind of this figure of the postmodern, basically humanities professor that kind of reads I would say kind of female and kind of reads kind of uh non-white at times, but like it is this is the antagonist, right? And like the debunking element also. I mean, I got into it in the 90s in college. I'm studying math, I'm studying science, it's like it's very much like up my alley, and I'm this obnoxious guy telling everyone that astrology is stupid, like that's kind of, and
Right.
getting justification for that, like
See,
and it always goes like, well, astrology is stupid because I know something about astrophysics, and then it's obviously not true, blah 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 blah, and then but it's just like, why does this, it always, later as you get drunker into the night or whatever, and you're still yelling at people, you kind of come to this point where it's like, well, why does this matter again? Like for society at large, and it's like, I don't know, you know, but
right,
it's an itch I want to scratch, right? And I feel like,
right. I think one of the interesting things about the Skeptic Society, it went after the stuff that you normally go after, which is the paranormal stuff plus creationism, but it also went after pseudo historical claims. All right, so Holocaust denial, extreme forms of Afrocentrism, and conspiracy theories. And so again, I found it pretty refreshing when I was in a I think I start school just a couple years later than you. And so
yeah,
I am like during the time period where in the university, like truthorism is actually both a left and right position, pretty common in the university. And also the university, and I think people forget this because this is 20 years ago, but the university was not yet like a place where liberal norms even were looked leftish the way they do now. It was liberal then too, but like I remember Patch Adams endorsing a anti-Bush book right after 9/11, and he got booed off stage at my university, right? Um and yeah, it's in Georgia, but that would not happen now. Even in a Georgia university, you wouldn't have that kind of thing. Um so what is interesting is what you see the beginnings of them dipping into what would become more politicized issues later. And then they also start around in the late 90s taking aim at postmodernism. Now, why this appealed to me is I have my hand in both worlds. I was a philosophy student who was more attracted to analytical philosophy at the time, who also had taken a bunch of anthropology courses and was fighting, was learning about the anthropology wars and picking the I consider there to be three sides, not two in the anthropology worlds, which is like we need to get rid of the racist, but also no, everything is not culturally relative. God damn it, there is such a thing as biology, and but yet I was also a humanist in that I was an English major, and in theory all the time. And I was reading Derrida and Foucault and the new historicists and Paul de Man and a lot of stuff is actually people, even though it's only 20 years ago, is completely fallen out of favor and no one references anymore. Deleuze and Guattari. I tried to read Lacan and decided that it wasn't comprehensible because my professor couldn't even explain it to me. And Rigore and Mouffe and all that stuff, like in that time period. And I remember just feeling like, oh, there's so much psychology in here that's like from the 1930s that we're just continuing to keep as valid because we do. Like, so Skeptics magazine appealed to me as a way to like fight the fight I was having in the humanities, which I also saw as a class thing because it was these upper middle class people that I was battling with. And I was like, you just believe bullshit because you're alienated from everything. And I was becoming more and more conservative, but at the same time, I was responding profoundly negatively to the actual Republican Party at the time because there's wars of expansion and this going after Muslims and stuff, particularly after 9/11, didn't sit well with me. And Skeptic magazine was actually more neutral on that than the New Atheist movement was.
Well, it was at the time, right? I mean, and that's kind of, I kind of have an inverted version of that same kind of, I was studying science, right? But I was studying science I went to Evergreen State College, which is a state university, but is not that, is not what the political environment that you described, right? I mean, this was a place that was full of, and
it still is full of
well, yeah, right. And but me, I'm coming in studying science at this like hippie university. I also, not white in this 90% white environment, coming from, and I had, and also, coming from a, I never had money growing up, and so I kind of had this reaction to the kind of, I saw in this kind of battle against postmodern dilettante thinking, like a lot of the people who were around me who like were incredibly fervent in their political beliefs but were driving like fancy, fervent in the expression of political beliefs, I'll say, right, but we're driving nice cars and like doing dumb rich kid stuff, right, or like what I perceived then as rich kids. I did, in retrospect, after having actually exposed myself to the ruling class, I realized they were just kind of small town people. But regardless, obviously you bring, that's what I brought to it. So I looked at it as this place of, okay, these are where the smart people are, and it put me in kind of it put me in kind of a technocratic framework. Like it got me thinking, and this is all before September 11th, because for me, September 11th is what got me off of this, right? But I was very much one of these I think I probably embodied that end of history thing, and just was like, politics doesn't matter, right? That there is no, politics is a technocratic realm for like a particular type of smart person, hopefully that reads Skeptic magazine, right?
Yeah,
But
politics is administrative policy. This is also an area where whether or not you're a right winger or a left winger, until 9/11, that you can kind of believe that we're just in a wonk world. Like,
yeah, and that the
yeah,
system basically works, right? That it works according to rationalist principles, right? And I guess, so for me, the big, I mean, I don't know, I'm historicizing my life, but like, some of the big junctures for me, one was, um, I mean, the big one was September 11th, and then the other was like Bush v. Gore, right? Because these were two, like Bush v. Gore was like kind of killed the technocratic concept that like the system works according to rules, that like,
yeah,
that like, okay, and this is me, I wasn't in law school at the time, but uh, um I was kind of, I was attracted to. I was thinking about it, kind of maybe ambiguously, but like, I did have this idea that that we have a rationalist system that basically is self-correcting, and that it's run by that's run by good, smart, liberal people, and um, and then the Bush v. Gore, I think, started to betray that in terms of like political reality, and then when September 11th happened and this kind of skeptic movement that was, that I think did go out of its way to be non-racist in a way, right? To be like, starts bringing in and you see more of the kind of the Sam Harris book from I guess 2004 or so or thereabouts.
In the history book is like, yeah, and that for me too, Abby, is when I realized that there was a problem. But I thought it was because neoconservative. I was still kind of a conservative, and we've talked about this. I didn't really totally break that till about 2005. It was a slow. Like I freaked out in 2003, 2004 about where the paleo conservative movement was going, but I didn't fully realize, like, I was kind of these libertarians are maybe neo-Confederates, so that's bad. So I'm gonna go hang out over here with these liberals, and it was in that period too where you could believe in bullshit like libertarian or left libertarian, but not in the way we mean it now, as in I'm an anarchist, but I won't own it. But in the way we mean it, the way we meant it then was like, I believe in social liberty and I believe in markets, but like racism is an actual problem. Like, and this, and we have to do something about the war. And I'm in that phase for a while. I get sucked in even into like the Houston Manifesto phase, which is weird. Because of my response to International Answer being a fucking joke. And I'm going through this and I'm like, okay, clearly Harris is off his rocker, because if you take him literally, we should bomb people based off the potentiality of their beliefs. I saw him argue with Scott Atran and other people and just realized, and I've studied anthropology, beliefs are can be post facto rationalizations for these sorts of things. But suicide bombings didn't even begin with Muslim bombers. They began with Tamil bombers. So you can't say Islam is what was the primary driver of this as a mechanism. And we also saw it in the Troubles too, in Northern Ireland. So like, what is actually going on here? It can't be explained by the content of beliefs. But I was still of the, but these Shermer people, like, they're not buying it. I didn't realize at the time, even though I should have, because I was coming out of that milieu, that what it was is a lot of those people have moved out of objectivism and into paleo libertarianism, and we're good anti-war people, but not mainly because they thought it fucked with capitalism. like that was what was going on at the time. And I also noticed that they wouldn't come out and say that Harris was full of shit. There were a few people who would, like members of the Skeptics movement in India, like Mirananda and stuff, would do it. But in general, like, it was taboo, and you would just see kind of Dan Dennett shrinking back and talking about Brights. We talked about the Bright controversy before, but and stuff like that. Whereas Skeptic magazine was like, no, we can't get involved in this policy. It's probably bad policy. We shouldn't be bombing people just because their beliefs. We believe in universal morality, blah, 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 blah. Morality is scientific. And by the way, that scientific morality happens to be libertarian, but we're not going to tell you that till later. And it felt like if I sided with them, it would like we could win a culture war within the skeptics movement. But what instead happened was you had this debate over accommodationist versus non-accommodationist. Do you remember this?
Yes, this was what really, the kind of, I mean, and this is echoed the kind of, this was happening all over the places. Why won't this cry of why won't the moderate Muslims um, speak out? Is that what you mean, or what does that
Yeah,
mean?
I mean, it was that. It was, but then it got expanded to, well, there was all kinds of people, including left-leaning new atheists like P.Z. Myers, who were like, no, I'm a non-accommodationalist because any belief in religion is going to protect religion as a concept and thus protect the most extreme form. And I was like, that's literally the same argument as like preemption in Iraq, dude. Like now it started off primarily with Muslims. I will say by the middle of the aughts, it becomes like Muslims and Christians, and then occasionally they will take the stance towards Jews, but Jews are the one thing that kind of throws everybody off in this movement.
Yeah, I mean, just I yeah, I had a similar. I guess I think I had a very similar reaction, but mine was kind of mediated through my family.
Right.
Many of my father's family is Muslim, uh, varying degrees of religiosity, but uh, the idea that there was some direct connection between like their affiliation with 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 Islam and like terrorism or any kind of these global political phenomenon. Just it seemed just patently absurd, especially because in Islam you don't even have the situation of a centralized like church, right? You have um, you know you have mosques, you have different kind of religious gatherings, but it's not
You even have complete. You have what, four? If you're a Sunni Muslim, you have five different schools of Sharia interpretation you could possibly go to. And none of whom have a single organized leader. I mean,
and yeah, exactly. And what did I see? What I saw was people in my family and the broader community who were becoming more fundamentalist were doing so through their affiliation with incredibly lush, fancy new mosques being built by Saudis, right?
right.
And so, you know, this is, I slowly started to realize that there's a deeper political phenomenon going on, a political economic phenomenon, because my family is from Ethiopia, which is not a country full of that many incredibly rich people who can go around building institutions to promote whatever interpretations they have, right? So we would see my father, who's not particularly religious, would lament that weddings aren't fun anymore, right? And that wasn't that wasn't some change in the Quran, right? That was the influence of a particular, like a Wahhabist or
Wahhabist or Salafist or yeah.
coming from a place from Saudi Arabia, right? With U.S. backed funding, right? And the irony of this happening after September 11th, right, was almost too much to bear, right? And then you have these, another one who was really kind of, I think probably as much as the Harris book was Ayan Hirsi Ali, like being affiliated with what's his name, and I think she married the guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the Netherlands, the kind of National Front type character. And so just this kind of this kind of direct target at Islam as a particularly irrational just didn't sit well, right? I mean, it's like if you compare kind of any like Sharia with any other kind of fundamentalist kind of, or like if there's Jewish sects, what
Holocaust
like
and Sharia like are almost the same thing for one thing, but
yeah, that's what I mean. Like if you're saying, oh, they don't let women do blah blah blah, and it's like, okay, like I mean, like in terms of sheer numbers, obviously Islam is a much huger religion, and if you're trying to like say that, but like these guys are supposed to be rationalists, and they're supposed they're supposed to say that it's, their thesis seem to be that it's like the religion itself that's doing these things, and it's like, well, you can't, it, there's a deeper sociological mechanisms going on here, right? Like that there's a and this is where I think your kind of background is such a contrast, right? Because I didn't have a background in humanities or kind of politics to really have a sense of kind of colonial history and global history to like make more sense of this at the time, right? But I just felt that it's like, oh, these people are like telling me that my auntie is a terrorist, and that's absurd. I guess I have to like find some new some new people.
right. I mean, so for me, I had this response of, one, I would be like, hey, why does all this stuff look like Christianity anyway? Now, I'm not like a Talil Assad guy who thinks that secularism is just Christianity in another form. I don't actually believe that. But I was like, you guys are kind of soft on certain Christian things that you're not soft on from other religions. Or in Sam Harris's case, you're soft on things in Buddhism and Jainism. Now, admittedly, in Jainism, it would be pretty hard to be a believing Jainist and be a terrorist. But there have been plenty of Buddhist terrorists in the history of Buddhism. So, and weird justifications for stuff.
Side note: I got off of Buddhism when I lived in Taiwan and had like the worst neighbor I've ever had, who was like a Buddhist monk.
Yeah, I mean, religion's not very predictive, actually, unfortunately, of attitude, because most religions have survived by being so complex that you can glom onto different things in them in different times. That's why they're still around. Jainism is weird because it's not one of those, but like in Christianity, I can pretty much ethically justify anything if between Christian history and the Bible. Like, and in Islam, I can find a fucking hadith to justify anything I want. Like, really, if I try. Like, and if I get, ironically, it is one of the things that's hard to explain to people. The fundamentalists in Islam have the broadest reading of hadith, which is kind of not what you'd expect, but that's just because it means I'll count any damn thing as a hadith. And for our listeners who don't know what hadith is, most of the rules in Islam outside of the pillars are actually hadith rulings. And Sharia is kind of codification of that. It is, in reality, a really, like, when you live it, I was already out of this way by the time I lived in Egypt, but living in Egypt confirmed it to me. I'm like, I saw the whole entire spectrum of observance in Egypt, from like burqa to barely, like Muslim women showing midriffs. Like, I saw the entire spectrum there, and nobody was killing each other over that. They were killing each other over things. Most of which was political, and the religious stuff was a gloss, but you did not see, like, even stuff like the acid attacks I made a big deal of in Britain and stuff. You didn't see any of that in Egypt. And in fact, when I was in Egypt, they used to joke, oh, it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Those are for diaspora Muslims who come back. Like, no one who's from here would ever do such a thing. And while that's not entirely true, it's mostly true. Like, it's not entirely true, particularly after the Brotherhood is politically suppressed and some of the members of the Brotherhood turn to ISIS for support and take a more radical position during the Al-Sisi government. But this is not something that the skeptics at the time could explain. And so the more I delved into the Iraq war, because I was anti-war, but I really wanted to understand it, I found a lot of the left narratives, like it was blood for oil and stuff, to be really unsatisfying. And so the more I learned, the more I was like, no, I don't get this. I don't really get out of the skeptics movement entirely, though, until about 2009. And that's because I start seeing, now I'm going to preface this, why it's a minority position, but the fact that it happened at all was concerning. You started seeing people like Pat Condall and stuff go into far right politics. Like you started seeing a lot of people who came up initially in kind of the more aggressive, mocking parts of the new atheist movement turn to what was going to become the alt-right, like the not quite white nationalist, but close adjacent part. And then we also had the experience of women in the skeptics movement, which was unbelievably universally bad. Like I had several female friends. In fact, one of my two female best friends were involved in the skeptics movement, and what they told me that happened about like around sexual harassment and worse at some of the conferences and stuff, it kind of split the movement. So the remnants of the movement are split. The exception to that I still sort of listen to, I stayed listening to the philosophically complicated parts of the skeptics movement until they quit. So Massimo Pagliucci in particular was somebody that I took seriously. I still take seriously, but as like, oh, well, he's at least scientifically literate. He doesn't pretend that science can answer everything. He has a complicated notion of rationality that isn't like common sense or some bullshit like this. He realizes there is actually philosophical problems with figuring out what science is. And he's also an active scientist. So I'll listen to him, but I quit listening to everybody else. And then all these scandals started really hitting the public. You had the Christ mysticist people all becoming Trumpists, like at that one conference. You had the beginning of things like James, not James Lindsay, who's the David Rubin, and some of the people, just really start coming out and sounding more and more like Coolette. You have Michael Shermer around 2007 start talking about Darwinian conservatism, and then him coming out on the conservative end of a lot of these things. And you just saw Skeptic magazine get really into the culture war, like particularly in the mid-aughts, like they try to do the Sokal hoax but for social sciences, but it's like way more dishonest than the Sokal hoax. It gets really, really gross, basically. And I'm just like, well, I made a good call, but what happened? And then what happened to most of the people is they just became normal liberals. Like if you listen to like some of the atheist podcasts that are now, they're basically now Democratic Party podcasts now. That's, if they didn't go this way. And so I was like, well, what does this say to me? Well, it says to me that what they think is driving society, aka ideology, aka religion, aka memetics, and all that crap that's been debunked now, is not driving society at all. Like that it reflects society.
I think the way you say that is right. I think that what when I revisited some of this stuff, what it left me thinking was, and almost coming out of the mouth of I think it was Sam Harris. What I listened to a book on tape of that Four Horsemen conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like they believe in Homo economicus, right? Like it's a model of human social change that is based on this kind of pure rational discourse, and
then imposing that on Whiggish history too. They're all Whiggish in their history. Like they don't believe that like things could get really worse ever. Like
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean that's where Pinker is the real prophet, right? I mean that's where you have this. I mean, and he's still going at that on that one. Like, but yeah, exactly right. That it's a Whiggishness, and it it's it just is antithetical to any kind of deep kind of understanding of history or politics, right? That it as soon as you know, I just don't I guess it's hard for me to in I guess today to maintain that level of uh, of wiggishness is it's just baffling, right? And it's part of to me it explains also why I thought I was crazy during that mid 2000s period, right? Because I was still mad about Bush v. Gore and lost this kind of the lost my belief in this kind of pure technocratic vision of a functioning society, and it kind of to me it explains also
A lot of other
like
people didn't until the end of the Trump administration, which is really fucking frustrating.
yes,
Like I
right,
think
and
about
this is why I didn't go crazy when Trump was elected. I just stopped reading Twitter because when Trump was elected, it was just like, oh no, this is just an obvious outcome of like
we can see all the steps, we can see how this is going, like we can see how even outsider politics has been co-opted into this, like, and we talked about this, people who were coming out of this movement. There are other people coming out of it. We talked about it. We did, for our listeners listening now, we did an attempt at this show that failed because I had massive systems failure, and then actually ended up being a good thing because we figured out what we wanted to talk about, really. But we talked about an interesting character who kind of came out of that libertarian world who Trump broke early. Dan Carlin, who was like always walking the line, kind of homo economicist, good liberal though, really did believe in liberal values, really did believe in discourse and parsing it off and talking through things commonsensically. It was I consider it politicized apolitical politics, which is like three contradictions, but it kind of is what it was. Like, we can deal with this as a community as long as we're pushing freedom for everybody, and we're not starting wars, and and we need more outsider voices. We need more this, that, and the other. And I think Trump broke him. He quit doing his political show. I mean, he will come on like twice a year and do Common Sense with Dan Carlin in response to specific things. But he, like, since Trump, there's like only been maybe 20. Like, and I think he had a crisis of like, oh no, this common sense politics doesn't work, and the market isn't doing what it's supposed to do, and that he doesn't seem immediately relevant to the to what we talk about as like the new atheist / skeptics movement sphere. But he came out of that world. He was like a political skeptic, and he spoke about a lot of the same themes, and I think his honesty led him to pretty much just giving up.
It's so interesting. It's so interesting. I mean, the Carlin thing, the Carlin connection is very interesting also because that's what I got into afterwards, right?
Right.
Because I got into Carlin, and I mean, my kind of trajectory towards the left goes through Dan Carlin. I mean, it was Carlin. Carlin introduced me to in probably around 2008. I got which is funny because I was working, I was working in the labor movement, and which was like shockingly devoid of political analysis. We were good organizers, but there was not a lot of there wasn't a lot of big picture. But like Carlin to like Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald. Greenwald got me into WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning, and that was kind of what set me up for like when Obama came in like a total crisis.
Greenwald
right?
is one of these weirdos to me, and that has, yes, for me with Obama too. I had a similar response to him, to Obama, and I was a big Greenwald defender until about 4 or 5 years ago. But one thing I pointed out, whenever I turned in the political sphere as I moved, Greenwald was somehow there. Like, when I was coming out of the paleo conservative movement, he was getting shared on LouRockwell.com. And for those who don't know, that's a very conservative libertarian site.
Anarcho-capitalist.
Anarcho-capitalists and neo-Confederates, and Stephen Molyneux got his start getting shared there when it was Free Domain Radio back before he was a racialist. The other thing that you saw that Glenn Greenwald in is when the ISO was still having socialism conferences, Greenwald was there too, and I was like, this man is everywhere.
Post 9/11, he was one of the big voices of the kind of not just the anti-Muslim ideology coming out of the government, but he was talking about the entrapment of Muslims and this kind of the theater of terrorism enforcement that was going on. Right, he was one of the few people really covering that stuff, and so he was kind of he was what kind of solidified my kind of civil libertarian kind of interests. This is me coming out of law school, working a lot on getting Obama elected, thinking that this guy at least is gonna this constitutional law professor is going to at least get rid of these civil liberties problems we have. But that was a setup for another kind of political crisis for me personally. but yeah, so that's a detour. But Carlin is one of those kind of bellwethers for.
But the other two went conservative. That's the thing. The other two, I wouldn't say that Glenn Greenwald is an out and out conservative, but like a man like that going on stage to do a positive profile of someone like Alex Jones is not something I ever thought I would have saw. When I look at the larger trends in political economy, though, it makes a lot more sense. Who's going to pay Greenwald, even from the fact he's mega rich and lives in Brazil? But who's going to pay him to do good investigative journalism anymore? Nobody. And Substack doesn't respond to that. It responds to culture war stuff.
It responds to culture wars. Yeah, I mean, I'm probably more inclined to put a kind of. There's some people who are just they make good lawyers sometimes, but they have a contrarian bug that is pathological. And I think that's kind of my at least folk interpretation.
I think you're right about that. My thing about that is the reason why Glenn Greenwald won't go away, though, is right now that contrarian bug will pay you back on Substack in a way that it wouldn't always.
Yeah.
And some of his contrarian bug has served us very well until recently. I just wish he would still talk about foreign policy instead of, I don't know, going on and defending Alex Jones. Similarly with Matt Taibbi. And Carlin's interesting because he just didn't go down that route.
He just quit.
He just quit. He decided I'm just gonna do history shit. I'm done. I
mean, I respect that, frankly, right? I mean, his history shows are good. I don't really listen to him anymore, but yeah, I mean, that's what that path. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of, those are the kind of choices you can make. Except, I mean, I guess
you can do Sam Harris and get involved with the IDW until it becomes all super unscientific, embracing the very things you spent, other than Islam, you spent your early life fighting. And well, Harris was always a little questionable on woo stuff. This is another stuff Mirananda got him on because he took some Buddhist claims from the New Age stuff way too seriously. But that when you started seeing the Weinsteins really pushing anti-scientific thinking and stuff like that, Harris was like, I have to split the baby. And that told me a lot. I mean, what basically happened with the Four Horsemen, we can go through them. Hitchens was always rhetorically super dramatic, and made some really terrible calls on politics towards the end of his life, from like 2001 forward. But if you actually read him, he's not actually as aggressive or anti-Muslim as Sam Harris.
No.
Dawkins really wanted to make everything this kind of very conservative, gene-centric focused view of biology. And if you read it, like The God Delusion, there are chapters in that where he's trying to argue like cosmology works like evolution. And I'm like, what? Why is no one calling this out? This is totally ascientific speculation, and like in a book that it makes no sense to be in. But what I noticed with him is like as the culture moved past and actually liberals started caring about some of these other issues, he just became more and more of an Anglican prig, like, and was constantly sticking his foot in his mouth. So much so that like most of the surviving atheist movement don't want anything to do with him either. Dan Dennett also basically pulls a Dan Carlin. He's still alive. He's still writing, but we haven't heard him doing anything about this cultural intervention stuff in forever. Probably in 10. I mean, he's old too, but Victor, some of the secondary players like Victor Stinger, PZ Myers, Jerry Coyne, they all move into different spheres. PC Meyer becomes more of a standard liberal activist. Jerry Coyne becomes kind of an academic science guy again, just trying to popularize, whatever. Victor Stinger seems to disappear. And then the Massimo Pelliucci becomes a stoic. And Julia Galef, who was a person I respected, even talked to her privately a couple times via Facebook chat, became more and more neoliberal, and she also stepped out of it. Like I was looking to see if what is it?
Rationally Speaking.
Rationally Speaking was still around, and it hasn't broadcast in a long time.
Really?
Yeah. So it just seems like a lot of these people just stepped out. And particularly what I find interesting, a lot of them stepped out right before or during COVID, the moment in which you would have thought as a social policy, the stuff they were advocating for would really fucking matter.
Yeah. And you know what, and going back to the theme of this this series, what at least in my kind of information space has stepped in for that is the Complexity podcast. I don't know if you follow that one from SFI. They really have filled in, like especially during COVID, because I mean, there's no better kind of milieu to understand a contagious global pandemic than at least some scientists who have a kind of multidisciplinary complexity-based kind of framework from the get-go, right? To understand how things might play out. So that was what kind of filled the gap for me. But I think also an important development and since that kind of basically since 2008 kind of, or even it coming into the Trump era, is the increasing availability of basically Marxism, right? Like Marxism is the ability of Marxism to be discussed, and for like people to try to understand politics from a more scientific perspective, I think is something that just didn't exist until very recently for just the average kind of like curious person, right? You had to actually be deep in
my
it.
caveat with this is as this whole Marxist revival has happened and talking about this stuff in a more Marxist way, I actually think it's also degenerating along similar lines to some of these other movements. because for reasons of like it's still just an intellectual movement, so it's still caught up in things beyond itself.
Yeah.
And while I do think like that gives you a certain amount of freedom to think in ways that are different, it also, however, means
Oh,
that like
it has quite its share of culture war baggage, obviously, right?
right.
It's just, I mean, especially Marxism, right? Like, so, I mean, obviously, yeah, there's no shortage of that either. And I mean, and that's why I'm kind of, it's like I'm not particularly caught up on whether I call myself a Marxist or not, but like what I am, what I'm interested in is that the project, right? The project of the scientific understanding of the world, right? And beyond, that and that doesn't mean that we can prove history using analytics, right? But it does mean we can use particularly what I find particularly useful, the broad field of complexity theory, complexity sciences, to like try to understand our political world, right? So, and to me, that's like the essence of what Marx was doing, right? I don't, obviously, um, we have this weird thing. The higher level we get, we can bring so many more parts of the world in and get into fights about them. But like, you know, um, but I think that was, going back to kind of the beginning of this conversation. You know, the hole in our attempt at understanding that was left by this kind of Cold War and anti-communism is no longer there to a large extent, and so that is a development, right?
Yeah, that is a positive development. However, what I think we're going to see is, interestingly, while the right actually realizes more sincerely the problems of capitalism, and so there is a schism between the populist right and the libertarian right in a way we really haven't seen in a long time. Like, you just think about the hostility of Trumpists towards people like Paul Ryan, and it really starts to make sense. The other thing that we can, and it's weird because the liberals are defending the Paul Ryans of the world, but it was not to say that the populist right is good, but it just shows you the contradictions that we all end up in. I think, interestingly, though, from both sides, separately and with separate logics, we're going to see a more visceral attempt to revive anti-communism, which is why this weird like Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy stuff from the far right became common parlance even on the center right. It's why there's this weird attempt to do, actually kind of like fascists did in their rhetoric, to blame certain groups on both communism and capitalism on groups that they don't like, simultaneously. Fill in the analog for Jews, are actual Jews here, etc. Because that taboo is gone. Like, and it really was a taboo. Like, even, and it lasted real long. I have been like a crypto Marxist since like 2008, 2009, but I was not comfortable saying it out loud. Like, I believe in historicism. I am Marxian in my thinking, because the social consequences of doing so back then would just have you like, no one would take a goddamn thing you said seriously. Like,
Yeah.
they immediately some like college sectarian weirdo that you encountered would be the first thing that came to their mind, and they would just write you out. And that changed pretty quickly after Occupy Wall Street. I like to remind people there were basically 5 left podcasts before Occupy Wall Street, 3 of which were already Pacifica radio shows anyway. And then there was Seeing Red Radio, which didn't survive, which was kind of a more orthodox Marxist. And there was like Diet Soap, which I worked with. That was literally pretty much it. Then the ISO would occasionally throw its conferences on as a podcast after the fact, and that was it. And then around 2014, there was a shit ton of them, and by like 2017, it's the most popular kind of political podcast period. They're all left wing, like, and by left wing I mean socialist even. That shift is significant. I do also think, however, we're going to get pushback from our allies more now too. I think that they no longer see us as useful. So our allies in quotation marks. But so the reason why I think systems theory and complexity theory and information theory is so useful for this is I think a lot of what continental philosophy was actually trying to do in its 19th century and early 20th century mode, and even up to like Althusser and stuff, which I don't love, but they were trying to figure out how to process things structurally, largely from people with humanities backgrounds, or soft science backgrounds. And it got stuck in a kind of academic neologism language that developed its own sort of logic and kind of removed itself from larger events, which I think that's the real ascientific nature of some of the continental philosophy, and particularly when people really get frustrated with the communist parties in their home countries, like the Communist Party of France, the Communist Party of Britain and Italy. That changes things for them. I think interestingly now, we don't have that baggage. And so, but we do have the hangover, because a lot of that theory in the 90s was brought to the United States as part of like the humanities end of the culture war. And while I think shitting on postmodernism is like kind of a waste of time, I do think there is a sense in which like it was a bad sign in liberal academia that it was the predominant movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point about running out. To me, it makes me think, these guys in the 60s and 70s. One of the big differences that we have now for that type of thinking, and I'm just kind of what we like, even thinking about it kind of I'm kind of a spatial thinker for a lot of these kind of things, like someone like Deleuze and rhizomatic like ontology or whatever, right? Like without the ability to do modeling, like computational modeling, it's really hard to get very far with that kind of stuff, like,
right? I mean,
without it being idiosyncratic, you know what I mean?
Which is right. I always like Deleuze is onto something with ribosomatic planning, but since he doesn't fucking understand math, we don't we don't actually go anywhere. It becomes a theoretical mystification, which is really unfortunate because it actually is helpful. And for example, there are a lot of Marxists now who are really stuck in 19th century models of maths and physics that are frankly debunked. And they're stuck in it because we don't have a lot of Marxist scientific writing that seems directly related to Marx. I mean, we do have Marxists who are doing scientific writing, like Stephen Jay Gould, or Haldane before him, and stuff like that. But you don't have a lot of Marxist scientific writing that you can pull from in the second half of the 20th century that isn't mired in explicitly decaying Soviet ideology, that even under its own like imperator doesn't really help anymore. And I think that's why there's a lot of Marxists now who have very outdated notions of science, or they'll go to like Lacan, or go to like stuff that has you know, and I'm not shitting on Lacanians. They actually do some interesting modeling or conceptual work sometimes, but it's not scientific.
Yeah, I mean, what fills in that gap? Who's doing the good thinking in that kind of interim period is the cyberneticians, right? I mean, like, you can't get a be. There's no. There's few better materialist thinkers than Stafford Beer, right?
Right, exactly. Stafford Beer and
Like,
Norbert Wiener, and Norbert Wiener admits how important Soviet thought, even though he's critiquing it in The Human Use of Human Beings, how important Soviet thought is to it. So much so that the fucking federal government shows up on his doorstep and revises the book.
well, yeah,
Like,
I mean, that, that's right, and like the place where actual nuts and bolts, low level materialism happens is not in economics, it's in business schools, it's in consulting. That's why so many of these that's what Stafford Beer did, right? Like, that's where you could do it, because where you get the non-ideological economics is in business. Right.
right, and that's why you also read specifically, like I tell people, don't read the Wall Street Journal's fucking editorial page. Don't even read The Economist. Read the actual business reports. They're honest. They're remarkably honest. Like, and when they disagree with each other, there's a contradiction going on because they don't know. But what is interesting about that is those things often do not resemble, you know, actual economic text at all. Like,
Mm-hmm.
not even a little. And the reason why is, like, if you're making money off this shit, you need to actually be able to do it. They don't want to be surprised by ideological mystifications when you're trying to make cold hard cash. Like,
Yeah.
I hate to tell you, but you don't want the powerful themselves don't want to be dumb enough to drink their own Kool-Aid. They often end up that way, but they don't want to be, like, because that's a problem, and they're not that dumb. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. You're the second person I've talked about the Skeptics movement with. The last time I talked about it, I just talked about it with Esri XP of Mortal Science, just on the end of talking about the weird trajectory of Massimo Pagliucci. And then he did an interview with Red Left Radio, which was about the weirdest thing I think has ever happened.
Pagliucci did?
Yep.
What?
Yep. Yeah.
Recently?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I'll check that out.
So I find that very, very interesting. But I think what we've discovered is basically, even for the people involved in the Skeptics movement and the New Atheist movement, after 9/11 and after that moment's over, there's not enough positive belief or anything for that movement to maintain itself, and it spins off in 1,000 different directions, many of which are reactionary because they were already kind of reactionary. I mean, one of the things that I pointed out, that new atheism differentiates itself from old atheism, partly because it's removing any relationship to political atheism, Marxism, etc., like, explicitly.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like, why is it new? Like, no one ever asked that question.
No, yeah, exactly. I mean, it might just as easily be called neo-atheism
Right.
to remind us of another neo than it is its actual ideology.
Yeah, maybe two neos.
Yeah, well, there's the split for you,
right? What? Whether or not you are just a neoliberal, or a neoliberal and a neoconservative. Yeah, I think that's kind of, this is kind of a cautionary tale. It's something we might come back to in particular figures because it's so big. But for both of us, for me, it was a bridge out of the paleo-conservative movement and then into liberalism, and then immediately out of liberalism. It was like, bam! Oh my God! Still right about liberalism. Obama's cabinet freaks me out, and also I had the same response to you, where I felt like I was insane for a long time, where I'm like, why can't you see that this is happening right under your nose, and you still believe that these thin veil of social norms that have been decaying, frankly, since the 70s, honestly, is going to hold the whole society together. And then when we get to Trump, they're like, we have to reestablish. I'm like, all your norms that were holding the entire government and together were just norms. They weren't even like rules. Like, they're just like habits. My God, man. Like, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's. I was in law school during this time. I mean, to me, I mean, it had genuine psychological effects for me. Finding my way out of that was like a mental health project. But it's like and I went to I went to a fancy law school, and like literally cocktail hour with Sandra Day O'Connor, and just being like everyone's acting like this is just a normal person who didn't just ruin the country and several others. Like, you know what I mean? It's like there's a problem. There's a problem. It's just like, well, ching ching,
Yeah.
like.
And now, like many things, like liberals who get all weepy-eyed about Bush, liberals get all weepy-eyed about Sandra Day O'Connor, because it was a fucking arbitrary. The thing about Sandra Day O'Connor, she had such an inconsistent jurisprudence. I couldn't even predict what she was gonna do. Like,
Yeah.
But yeah, although I don't want to end. We're talking about this. That'll eventually get me talking about, like, if I see another person, like if I see another fucking liberal saints candle, literally liberal saints candle to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I'm gonna like break stuff.
Well,
Like,
but this all it all undermines. I mean, to go back to the topic, it undermines the thesis, right? It like the saints candle, like these things are not like rationalist choices, right? Like
no.
we all have gods, and there the there's the to me in a lot of ways, like the idea, the beauty of kind of exploring and producing and kind of coming up with and thinking about like these political philosophical topics is like discovering who your gods are, and the this journey for me has very much been like that liberal God is strong in all of us, right? Like that liberal saint candle in our society, like, is just incredibly powerful. And so, like, it's one of those trick candles kind of that keeps lighting itself back up, like the kind of, so, I think that to me, that's part of the process, right? Is like dredging these things out and seeing how they reappear, and ideally, hopefully, thinking of ways to like squelch them for the next go around.
It is hard. I mean, I think part of the problem, and this is where the leftists really are kind of in lurch, is while our analysis has come back, we still haven't got to the strength where we feel like we can say, yeah, and fuck those guys too. Like, we always feel like, well, the Trumpists are scary, and sometimes they are. I know that I was in trouble during most of the Trump years for being like, the alt-right, it's probably actually, it's a problem, and they might kill people, but I don't think they're actually going to take over the military, and I don't think they're going to be allowed to take over the country, even with Trump's help. Like, I think General Miley might put a bullet in Trump's head before that happened. I probably shouldn't say that on air, but it just seems, at least arrest him. Like I just can't see, like, do you think the most powerful military the world has ever known, that keeps the most powerful economic engine the world has ever known going, it's just going to let a bunch of reactionaries ruin it all for everybody, like, without doing anything? I
That was always, I didn't follow January 6th super close, but I kept asking my friends and family who were following it, is like, tell me what the military guys are doing, right? And I don't, it's just like, I'm not talking about it, and it's like, it's not,
No, I'm not talking about like the 1 in 4 rank and file lower
a
level
pencil
military
pusher in
people.
the Pentagon doesn't matter, but a general, even a colonel, like someone, if there's someone whose troops will follow them, and
Mhm.
they're like way off base, then we might have a problem, right? But like until then, it's like I don't know, I mean we can have a lot of problems, but like you can't have a coup without an army.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
but I mean,
basically. Yeah.
we could talk about January 6th. January 6th was another one of those things that kind of had a very different. I mean,
But I
maybe
will tell
I'll talk
you,
to you
we
off
could
air
talk
about that.
about January 6th. It will be an audio only show because every time I've talked about January 6th, I've had it removed from
Oh
YouTube.
right, yeah.
Like, um, yeah, it's which is funny because I've never been particularly sympathetic, but like,
It doesn't matter. I mean, the robot doesn't care.
the robot does not care. Like, um, a robot overlords are kind of dumb. Um, so like, man, also to talk about the skeptics movement. All those transhumanists in 2008 who really thought that like we were gonna have super AI overlords who were smarter than us. I I want Ray Kurzweil to apologize to me. like, like,
Oh, I forgot about him. He was a big one too. Yeah.
yeah. Like, man, that it's a weird. As that went on, it got weirder and weirder. That's the thing. Like the transhumanist stuff. The we have totally erased that meme used to refer to memetics, and like there's this whole attempt to completely replace sociology, anthropology, and social psychology with meme theory,
Yeah.
which which was also something that was big in the skeptics movement, and like made no sense.
But
Like,
it's just, again, it's one of those things. It's like if you can't access the concept of political economy, and because we've our disciplinary system has removed it, and like again until very recently, right? Like, if you can't have, if there is no integrated multidisciplinary social science, you get caught up in these direct analogies that are basically dumb, right? You're
yeah,
just like, where you're just like, oh, what if everything was physics? What if everything was a cell? And it's like, no, like we need to we need this bigger integrated theory, and it's like we need the tools that people have developed those, and we need to build that for our political purposes. And so, I think that that's kind of the project that I feel that you're on. And a lot of, I through your show, I've been introduced to a lot of the what there's the alpha to omega, and that whole slew of
the Emancipation Project, which I used to be a part of, which has a general intellect unit looking at
general
cybernetic
intellect unit.
theory.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and then you have two shows that are not part of that, but are closely related. What is Politics by Daniel Bitton on anthropology, and then Fight Like an Animal on anthropology and biology.
Fight Like an Animal, I quite like. Yeah, I've communicated with him a little bit. We shared the same kind of. Uh, where I was out in the Pacific Northwest at the same time. I heard about him like in college. It was like there's this crazy kid living on a mountain, like it was like I emailed him. I was like, "Is that you?" And he was like, "Yeah." So, but I really like that show. But yeah, it's not that it's not that many people doing this. I've been doing this, and I've been doing this kind of project in my weird way as a lawyer through kind of tech, kind of hacker communities, and and with collaborations with a close friend who's a computational biologist, and I did another thing with a guy who I wonder if you. I should ask you this: when you were with Zero Books, did you ever work with Chris Vitale? Does
I know
that
who he
name sound
is. I didn't
familiar?
work with
Yeah.
him, but I know who he is. Yeah.
I mean,
I
he's
mean,
someone.
like I accepted the book, so like the, Zero Books was an interesting prospect. And now that I don't work for, I can talk about my job as editorial person there was just to read the submissions, and to also to recruit people for submissions. But I actually didn't. The editorial staff outside of the publisher did not actually work with the author beyond the acceptance stage. So we give them notes on like stuff that like we're accepting the book, but you need to address this, 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 and this. But we actually never saw it again until it was published.
Oh wow. Okay.
So yeah. So yes, I remember his book.
Yeah. I did a presentation. I did a couple kind of things with him, and he's been like very helpful to me, just personally. But what I'm saying is like that kind of his book was called Networkologies, and he's another one of these humanities people who's like trying to like do like grapple with science and
yeah, his stuff. He came in actually. That book was published. Like right in the transition, so he is actually a little bit before me now that I think about it. But I do remember that book because it came out, I think it was released and we promoted it after Doug was in charge, or at least as he was involved. I think he became involved in 2015. Maybe no, 2014. It was 2014. But I don't think I was in the group that accepted it. But yeah, it's the Networkologies book, which is, I think I want to defend. We've been shitting on the humanities. I actually want to defend the humanities study of the sciences.
Oh yeah.
It's actually important that there are some outside people looking at this, like in a historical context. But I will say we often, when we try to get into the nitty gritty of the science, unless you are one of the people you don't need a lot of science training to say something meaningful, but you do need some, and more than what you're going to get in just core classes in undergrad.
No, I mean, I think this is a really good point that I think what's fascinating. So back to the skeptics, it was I think it was James Randi who spoke to Congress in the late '90s, right at the kind of in the height of this kind of skeptic movement, and what he he kind of talked about hoaxes, and one of the big targets was supplements, right? Which is definitely a regulatory loophole, but that is, but the kind of basically snake oil salespeople and what have you. But when it came to policy, it was like we need more science funding, and like in response to what you just said, I think what we need is more humanities, right? People need to have a broader because so much of the like delusion of that skeptic moment was a lack of kind of philosophical and political understanding by the scientific promoters, right? And like, I would just say like that what we need to understand, what we need to understand how science and society works better is actually more humanities, right? We need a rounder understanding of a totality, right?
Right. I would actually also say that the humanities need to study math and science more.
But absolutely.
Absolutely. But what I in my ideal world would do would take what we currently do in undergrad, expand it, and move it to high school, which absolutely. No one would like right now. Like, because everyone's very like, but I'm just like, well, because I don't know. Maybe this can be our next topic because it's something that I actively study and work in. Education is failing across the board right now. And that's weird because we're in a time period where access to the stuff you need to get an education is more readily available than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can find ways to get books on any niche topic that I need scholarly books on. Like, period.
And compound that with the kind of AI being able to write a B plus paper for most topics.
Yeah. B
It
plus paper
creates,
till you hit like it probably undergrad senior level. You should write better than chatbot, but other than that, like,
and so it is a crisis in education, right? And I think that you know, no, it is definitely interesting topic.
well, I think this is one of the interesting things about what I'm trying to do in socialist world is one hand I'm arguing that education as we understand it as an institution and just throwing money at it actually probably isn't going to fix your problems. However, you guys do need to know more than you do. Like, just yeah, we've been awakened to Marxism. Great. What are you going to do about it? And if you tell me memes, I'm going to punch you. Like, probably won't actually punch you. I'm not even saying memes don't help, but we do need, like, a political project and a research project like this goes in tandem, and we need to build this, and not just in a think tanky way so we have socialist policy, but also in, like, we need to be able to explain the world in a way that can compete with other ways of explaining the world, in that it both has a true function and is also useful. Like,
Yeah,
and if we can't do that, then we fucking fail at our job. So, but that is tied into the fact that I feel like these days when I talk about so many different topics, I have to, and I'm willing to do it because I'm a teacher. A lot of my shows start off real basic and then go real deep, but we start off real basic because most people know only the basic level, even if they're college educated. Like, it's usually because they're college educated in something very specific. We have a very specialized form of education, and it's not to say they're miseducated. It's just it's super narrow, and they outsource all thinking on other topics to other things, and we can't get anywhere with that because it's like, well, then you're just gonna, like, if you're outsourcing like your thoughts on social justice to social justice specialists, you're gonna just repeat what the Democratic Party wants you to repeat. Like, that's the way it's gonna go. You're not gonna be surprised by Noah Friedman, at Harvard being, or Yale, or wherever the fuck he's at, being wrong about law. Like, are like are you're gonna be surprised because I said you're not gonna be surprised. You're gonna be surprised because you haven't thought about it systemically, and then, like, these people who are institutionalists and why they can't do anything. I mean, the fact that even radical left criticals of liberals think that it's just bad faith, I'm like, no, like, these people, there's an institutional logic that really is blinding. Like, and if you're really invested in it, it is really hard to get out of. And although if you're kind of half in it and you see, I don't know, Bush v. Gore, and just go, did the Supreme Court just decide an election? Like, contra to the process in the Constitution, even, like, that's
but
a
with a
weird thing.
decision that has with a decision that has no precedential value according to its own.
It's a one-off. Like,
Yeah, I
we
mean,
just
it's
needed
just,
this to happen right now. Thank you. Like,
yeah, no, I mean, I think that I mean, there's a lot of places to go because I've even talked to you about the stuff I studied in my master's where I did a real deep dive on Richard Rorty, um, who, uh, but but which I think has some relevance in this field, a kind of hermeneutical approach to basically to truth. But that's only one strain of the postmodernists that I think is that we can get into one of these days, maybe.
fair enough. And on that, we're going to end our first episode of Vulgar Complexity. Have a great evening.